Warning: the stories you are about to hear may contain sensitive topics such as physical, mental, or substance abuse, sexual content, violence, and gore. These stories are fiction and do not reflect any person or entity. Listener discretion is advised. Hello, everyone. I'm Bruhdriguez, and welcome to the Moonlit Hour. In tonight's story, we find Joey, who desperately tries to escape death after recalling the stories he heard as a kid and seeing the figure that has struck fear into the hearts of his family. What will you do when death comes knocking? Joey sat by the living room window with his knees up to his chest. Sweat dripped down his forehead as fear caused his body to panic. So many thoughts ran through his head, but one thought in particular made his heart race. When he was a kid, Joey's grandmother would tell him stories about some strange ramblings his grandfather would say right before he passed away. "Your grandfather kept insisting that he would see a man standing in our yard," his grandmother would say. He described the man as a black shadow figure. He couldn't make out any features of the man. The only thing for certain was the man wore a hat and carried a briefcase. No one took Joey's grandfather seriously because no one else could say they ever saw such a man anywhere outside. Joey was just 4 years old when his grandfather died. It wasn't until his grandmother told him the stories when he was 12 that he and everyone became concerned. His grandmother had began to ramble about seeing the same figure. No one knew what to make of it, but when she passed away shortly after, it was something the family began to live in fear of. The family had no indication of her untimely death, as she seemed healthy as always. Her cause of death was labeled as natural causes. Joey's grandfather had cancer that caused his health to decline rapidly, thus indicating his death was only a matter of time. As word began to spread of these stories of a shadow man awaiting shortly prior to their deaths, it became clear that seeing this figure surely meant a terrible fate awaited for the viewer. 2 nights ago, Joey, now 19, was laying in bed scrolling through his social media pages, when all of a sudden the dogs in his neighbor's yard began to bark very aggressively. He looked out of his window from the second floor and noticed a figure at the opposite end of the street looking in his direction. His house was the second to the last house on the block, and his room had a very good view of the neighborhood in both directions, paired with the streetlights illuminating the dark roads. This figure stood in perfect sight, like it wanted to be seen by Joey. Seeing the mysterious man triggered the memory of those stories his grandmother would tell him. Chills began to run down his spine as he was hit with the sudden realization that this supposed bringer of death was coming for him. He laid back in bed trying to muffle the sound of the dogs barking to no avail. He didn't want to look back outside and regretted ever looking in the first place. Eventually, the dogs stopped barking and Joey found the courage to look again. The figure was gone. He was too scared to fall asleep, but eventually his eyes couldn't handle the strain and closed for the night. Joey awoke the next day with relief. He wondered if it was all just a dream. He'd even accept that he was going crazy, as long as it didn't mean he was going to die. With his parents being separated, his mom working late nights, and his dad hating that he can't come home, Joey had no one to turn to. He decided to go about his day like normal. He would go to his night class and then go home and relax. Joey got home that night having forgotten about the figure. Being able to go about his day and focus on his class was enough to get his mind off any impending doom. He parked his car in the driveway and exited. He went to his back seat on the driver's side to retrieve his backpack. As he began to put it on, he could hear the neighbor's dogs barking aggressively once again behind him. Reluctantly, Joey turned around and locked onto the figure which was now standing on his side of the street at the corner. The light from the street lamp shined upon the figure, but it was still a black shadow in nature. No features of any kind could be made out, and looking at it was like looking into a pitch black void. Joey's body went cold. He became frozen with fear, yet his body felt as if he was in a falling dream, except he wasn't waking up. The figure began to glide towards Joey at a very slow and eerie pace. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't walking. It had the body of a man, but nothing about it looked human. Joey managed to snap out of it, and with clammy hands, he slammed his car door shut and ran for the front door of his house. He wasn't sure how he made it since his legs felt weak, almost as if they weren't even there, but he figured it must be adrenaline. He shut the door behind him and peeked through his living room window. The figure was standing back at the street corner. The neighbors' dogs were still barking aggressively at the figure, but this time they were attacking the fence. The neighbor stepped outside to investigate the barking. He began to command the dogs to stop barking and sit, but they wouldn't listen. He got closer to the fence and pulled the dogs away, the figure remaining visible to Joey, but somehow not to his neighbor. His neighbor didn't acknowledge the presence of the figure. Joey began to understand that he was the only one who was meant to see this dark figure. Joey's mind began to race and his heart was beating rapidly. This has to be a mistake. Why at such a young age would death take any interest in him? There's so many things he has yet to achieve and much more he'd love to experience. He was healthy and no medical reason to fear such an early demise. So much was running through Joey's mind that he didn't realize the dogs had stopped barking. He looked out the window to see the dogs had gone, possibly taken inside by his neighbor, and the figure was nowhere to be seen. The unsettling part was that even if the figure was gone, it might still be lurking somewhere else unbeknownst to Joey. It wasn't a good idea to sleep. Joey feared if he gave in to sleep, then he might not wake up. He decided he would try as hard as he could to stay awake for as long as possible. He didn't want a chance never waking up again. The hours went by, and Joey was beginning to lose track of time. He was several cups of coffee in. The caffeine mixed with anxiety began to cause Joey to be very jittery. A full 24 hours had gone by, and as if on cue, the dogs in the neighbor's yard began to go wild again. The figure this time was standing right at the edge of the lawn. Joey began to process how much closer the figure was now, and he dropped to the floor with his knees pulled tight to his chest. The sweat of nervousness began to run down Joey's head and tears began to form in his eyes. He wasn't sure what terrified him more, the fact that he was going to die, or the thought of how he might die. He hoped it was quick and painless, but he didn't want to die to begin with. Suddenly, he heard the screeching of the tires pulling into his driveway. He looked out and saw his mom's car. The figure remained there motionless as his mom exited the vehicle. To his surprise, his dad was with her, but he looked very angry, and she looked scared. Neither of them paying any mind to the dark figure that was overlooking the house. The door opened, and his mom and dad came charging into the house. His mom was crying, and his dad was very angry. "What's going on?" Joey asked. "It's okay, son," Joey's dad replied. "It's gonna be just fine." His dad seemed to be drunk, which is something that was common, and also the reason for the separation of his parents. His mom couldn't handle the drinking and abuse. She finally had the courage to leave him. "Mom, are you okay?" Joey asked. She remained silent as she continued to cry. "Leave her alone," Joey yelled to his dad. "Do you see what you've done?" Joey's dad asked his mom. "You've taken everything from me, and you turned my own fucking kid against me. I don't know who you think you are, but that shit ends tonight." Joey stood up and tried to approach his mom. Before he could reach her, his dad pulled a gun from his waistband and shot her in the head. Her brains splattered across the floor as the blood poured out of her head and pulled up on the outline of her body. Joey fell to his knees in shock at what he just witnessed. He tried to process the event as everything around him fell silent. As he looked away from his mom and towards his dad, he noticed the gun was now pointed at him. "Don't worry," his dad began. "We will all be together again." He pulled the trigger and the bullet hit Joey straight in the chest. Joey fell on his back as the pain shot through his body and his vision began to blur. Joey's dad, without hesitation, turned the gun on himself and fell dead instantly. Joey could hear his dad's body hit the floor in a muffled sort of way. A cold chill began to overcome Joey's body. He realized this was the end for him. The room began to turn dark, but he realized that this was just the figure standing in front of him. Up close and personal, the dark entity was even more terrifying. That's simply all it was. A figure made of pitch black darkness that you could not tell a single feature on it. Even its hat and briefcase were pitch black. The figure pulled a single paper from his briefcase, which looked to be more of a scroll of old parchment paper. It grabbed Joey's hand and dipped his index finger in his own blood. The figure pressed Joey's bloody finger to the paper, which was angled just enough for Joey to read what it said. The last thing Joey saw as his eyes glazed over was his name and the names of his parents on a certificate of death held by the figure that has haunted his family.